This might be attained subsequently, as so often happens, through a sense of social duty and the feeling of love and pity. This is why the rationalistic interpretation of the world, which, as impartial as money, has also come close to the socialist image of life, has become the advocate of modern egoism and the ruthless assertion of individuality. According to the usual and not exactly profound point of view, the ego is, in practice no less than in theory, man's obvious basis and unfailing primary interest. Any selfless motives appear not to be natural and autochthonous but secondary and, as it were, artificially implanted. As a result, only self-interested action is considered to be genuinely and simply logical. All devotion and self-sacrifice seems to flow from the irrational forces of feeling and volition, so that men of pure intellect treat them ironically as a proof of lack of intelligence or denounce them as the disguise of a hidden egoism. This is certainly mistaken, since even the egoistic will is just as much a will as the altruistic will and can just as little be squeezed out of merely rationalistic thought. Rather, as we saw, rationality can only supply the means for either of them. It is totally indifferent to the practical purposes which either of them choose and realize. Yet this connection between pure intellectuality and practical egoism is none the less broadly accepted, and it may have some basis in reality, if not in terms of the logical immediacy claimed for it, then in some indirect psychological manner. Yet not only genuine ethical egoism but social individualism too appears as the intellect's necessary corollary. Any collectivism that establishes a new living unity transcending its individual constituents seems to the sober intellect to contain an element of impenetrable mysticism, in so far as it is not reducible to the mere sum of its individual members, just like the living unity of an organism, in that the intellect cannot understand the unity as a mechanism of the parts. Hence the rationalism of the 18th century, which culminated in revolution, is bound up with a strict individualism, and only the opposition to rationalism from Herder to the Romantics has, in acknowledging the superindividual emotional potential of life, thereby also recognized the superindividual collectivities as unities and historical realities. The universality of intellectuality, in that it is valid for each individual intellect, brings about an atomization of society. By means of the intellect and viewed from its standpoint, everyone seems to be an enclosed self-sufficient element alongside every other, without this abstract universality somehow being resolved into the concrete universality in which the individual person only forms a unity in combination with others. Finally, the inner accessibility and reflectiveness of theoretical knowledge, which cannot basically be withheld from anybody, as can certain emotions and volitions, has a consequence that directly offsets its practical results. In the first place, it is precisely because of their general accessibility that factors quite independent of personal capacities decide on the factual utilization of knowledge. This leads to the enormous preponderance of the most unintelligent educated person over the cleverest proletarian. The apparent equality with which educational materials are available to everyone interested in them is, in reality, a sheer mockery. The same is true of the other freedoms accorded by liberal doctrines which, though they certainly do not hamper the individual from gaining goods of any kind, do however disregard the fact that only those already privileged in some way or another have the possibility of acquiring them. For just as the substance of education, in spite of, or because of its general availability, can ultimately be acquired only through individual activity, so it gives rise to the most intangible and thus the most unassailable aristocracy, to a distinction between high and low which can be abolished neither, as can socio-economic differences, by a decree or a revolution, nor by the goodwill of those concerned. Thus it was appropriate for Jesus to say to the rich youth, "Give away your goods to the poor," but not for him to say, "Give your education to the underprivileged." There is no advantage that appears to those in inferior positions to be so despised, and before which they feel so deprived and helpless, as the advantage of education. For this reason, attempts to achieve practical equality very often and in so many variations scorn intellectual education. This is true of Buddha, the Cynics, certain currents in Christianity, down to Robespierre's Nous en avons pas besoin de savants. In addition, there is the very important fact that the location of knowledge in speech and writing, which, viewed abstractly, are a manifestation of its communal nature, makes possible its accumulation, and, especially, its concentration, so that, in this respect, the gulf between high and low is persistently widened. The intellectually gifted or the materially independent person will have all the more chances for standing out from the masses the larger and more concentrated are the available educational materials. Just as the proletarian today has many comforts and cultural enjoyments that were formerly denied to him, while at the same time, particularly if we look back over several centuries and millennia, the gulf between his way of life and that of the higher strata has certainly become much deeper, so, similarly, the rise in the level of knowledge as a whole does not by any means bring about a general leveling, but rather its opposite. I have analyzed this phenomenon at length because the contrasts in meaning which the concept of intellectuality exhibits are completely analogous to those found in money. The understanding of the essence of money is not only facilitated by its interaction with intellectuality, which gives them a formal similarity, but perhaps also by an underlying common principle that is manifested in the similarity of their development, perhaps by reference to the fundamental condition or disposition of those historical elements which, by giving them form, constitute their style. We have pointed out in the preceding chapters how much money, on the basis of its general availability and objectivity, nonetheless facilitates the growth of individuality and subjectivity, how much its unchanging uniformity, its qualitatively communistic character, leads to each quantitative difference becoming a qualitative one. This extension of the power of money that is incomparable with that of any other cultural factor, and which gives equal rights to the most contradictory tendencies in life, is manifested here as the condensation of the purely formal cultural energy that can be applied to any content in order to strengthen it and to bring about its increasingly purer representation. I therefore propose to emphasize only some specific analogies with intellectuality in terms of its content, to the effect that the impersonality and universal validity of its abstract objective nature, at least, with reference to its function and use, supports egoism and differentiation. The rational and logical character that is displayed by egoism also adheres to the full and ruthless exploitation of the possession of money. Earlier, we pointed to the distinctive feature of money compared with other forms of property, namely that it does not point to any specific use and therefore implies no inhibition as to its use. Money is completely adaptable to any use without any relationship of its quality to that of the real objects, thereby bringing about any specific encouragement or obstruction. Money is therefore similar to the forms of logic which lend themselves equally to any particular content, regardless of that content's development or combination. It thus grants the same chances to representation and formal correctness to the objectively most nonsensical and detrimental contents as it does to the most valuable. Furthermore, money is also analogous to the schemes of law which often enough lack safety devices for preventing the most serious injustice from being endowed with an unimpeachable formal righteousness. This unrestricted possibility for fully exploiting the power of money appears not only as a justification but also, as it were, as a logical conceptual necessity for doing so. Since money intrinsically contains neither directives nor obstacles, it follows the strongest subjective impulse that within all money matters appears to be the egoistic impulse. The inhibiting notion that certain amounts of money may be stained with blood or be under a curse are sentimentalities that lose their significance completely with the growing indifference of money, that is, as money increasingly becomes nothing but mere money. Money's purely negative quality, that its use, unlike other forms of ownership, is in no way restricted by objective or ethical considerations, inevitably develops into inconsiderateness as a completely positive kind of attitude. Money's flexibility, which follows from its being detached from particular interests, origins and relations, entails as a necessary logical consequence the invitation to us not to restrain ourselves in those spheres of life in which money predominates.